Baby found a bear. Cub hidden in a mechanic shop lift. What he did next. Fixed everything. The old mechanic shop sat at the edge of town where the streetlights ended and the forest began. A place where metal met nature in an uneasy truce. Ethan Marshall had inherited the shop from his father 3 years ago, and every evening found him there long after his employees had gone home, working beneath cars with only the hum of fluorescent lights for company. The smell of motor oil and grease had become his cologne, the clank of tools his evening symphony. His 7-year-old son Logan often accompanied him on these late nights, not because Ethan particularly wanted him there, but because Jessica, his wife, insisted that father and son needed to spend more time together. The truth was, Ethan didn't know how to talk to Logan anymore, not since the boy had started asking questions about why Daddy worked so much, why he missed baseball games, why he always seemed tired. So they existed in the same space but different worlds, Ethan beneath the cars and Logan playing with toy trucks in the corner, creating elaborate stories that his father never quite heard over the sound of his work. That particular October evening started like any other, with the autumn wind rattling the shop's metal doors and leaves skittering across the concrete floor whenever someone opened them. Logan sat cross-legged near the hydraulic lift, making engine sounds with his mouth as he pushed a red toy car along an imaginary road he'd drawn with chalk on the floor. Ethan was deep in the engine compartment of a 1997 Ford pickup, wrestling with a stubborn water pump that refused to come loose. The radio played softly in the background, some country station that neither of them really listened to, but that filled the silence between them. The shop felt colder than usual that night, autumn finally showing its teeth. And Ethan had given Logan his jacket to wear over his small hoodie. The boy looked comically small in it, the sleeves hanging past his hands, but he wore it proudly, occasionally sniffing the collar where it smelled like his father's aftershave, and the faint trace of cigarettes that Ethan thought he'd successfully hidden. It was Logan who heard it first, a sound so soft that it barely registered above the ambient noise of the shop. He stopped making his engine sounds and tilted his head, the way children do when they're trying to identify something their young minds can't quite place. "Daddy," he said, but Ethan was cursing at the water pump and didn't hear him. Logan stood up, the oversized jacket dragging on the floor as he walked closer to the hydraulic lift where an old Chevy sat elevated 6 feet in the air. The sound came again, a tiny whimper that seemed to echo from somewhere beneath the car, or maybe from inside the lift mechanism itself. Logan knew he wasn't supposed to go near the lift when a car was on it. Daddy had told him that 100 times, but something about that sound pulled at him in a way he couldn't explain. It sounded sad, the way he felt sometimes when he woke up from a bad dream and Daddy wasn't there because he was still at the shop. "Daddy, something's crying," Logan said louder this time. And finally, Ethan emerged from under the hood, a smear of grease across his forehead that made him look like a warrior in some ancient battle against machinery. "What's that, buddy?" Ethan asked, not really listening, already thinking about getting back to the water pump. But Logan was persistent in the way only children can be, tugging at his father's dirty work pants with those small hands lost in the jacket sleeves. "Listen, Daddy, something's crying in the lift." Ethan was about to dismiss it, to tell Logan it was probably just the wind or a squeaky belt somewhere, but then he heard it too. A sound that didn't belong in a mechanic shop, something alive and small and frightened. They approached the lift together, Ethan automatically putting his arm out to keep Logan at a safe distance while he investigated. The hydraulic lift was an old model, installed back when his father first opened the shop in 1982, and it had more hiding spots than a magician's cabinet. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox, one of those heavy metal ones that doubled as a weapon in rough neighborhoods and shone it into the gaps and crevices of the lift mechanism. At first, he saw nothing but the usual accumulation of decades of grease and dirt. Maybe a few spider webs that Jessica would have insisted he clean if she ever came to the shop anymore. But then, the light caught something that made him stop breathing for a moment. Two eyes reflecting back at him like tiny amber moons in the darkness. "Stay back, Logan," Ethan said, his voice taking on that serious tone that meant business. But Logan had already seen the eyes too, and his reaction was completely different from his father's caution. "It's a baby?" Logan whispered with the kind of certainty that only children possess, before adults teach them to doubt their first instincts. Ethan got down on his knees, angling the flashlight to get a better look without startling whatever was hiding in there. What he saw made no sense in the ordered world of his mechanic shop. It was indeed a baby, but not the human kind Logan might have imagined. A bear cub, impossibly small, maybe only a few weeks old, was wedged into a gap in the lift mechanism that seemed barely large enough to hold it. The cub was trembling, its dark fur matted with oil and dirt, and when it saw them looking, it let out another of those heartbreaking whimpers that had first caught Logan's attention. Ethan's mind raced through the logical explanations. How a bear cub could have ended up in his shop, in his lift of all places, but none of them made any sense. The nearest forest was half a mile away, and bears didn't just wander into town, especially not cubs this young without their mothers. "We need to call animal control," Ethan said, already reaching for his phone, but Logan had other ideas. The boy had shed the oversized jacket and was now on his belly on the cold concrete, trying to get closer to the cub. "He's scared, Daddy. Look how scared he is." The cub was trying to press itself further back into the gap, but there was nowhere else to go. Its eyes darted between Ethan and Logan, and in them, Ethan saw something that stopped him from making the call. It wasn't just fear in those eyes, it was trust. The kind of desperate trust that comes when you have no other choice but to believe that someone will help you. "We can't just leave him there," Logan said, and for the first time in months, Ethan really looked at his son. Logan's face was streaked with dirt from lying on the shop floor, his hair sticking up at odd angles, but his eyes were bright with purpose. This was important to him in a way that Ethan couldn't quite understand, but somehow felt in his chest. "Okay," Ethan said, surprising himself with the word. "Okay, but we have to be careful. Even baby bears can bite and we don't know if it's hurt." He went to his tool cabinet and pulled out his thickest work gloves, the ones he used for handling hot metal. Logan watched with the intensity of a surgical assistant as his father carefully began to work on accessing the gap where the cub was trapped. It took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, removing a panel here, loosening a bolt there, all while the cub watched them with those amber eyes. Logan kept up a steady stream of soothing chatter, telling the cub about his toy cars, about his teacher, Mrs. Henderson, about how his daddy could fix anything, even scared baby bears. When Ethan finally created an opening large enough to reach the cub, he hesitated. This was the moment where everything could go wrong, where the frightened animal could lash out, where he could end up in the emergency room explaining to Jessica how he'd let their son convince him to rescue a wild animal. But Logan's hand found his, those small fingers wrapping around his much larger ones, and together they reached toward the cub. The first contact was electric, the cub's fur softer than Ethan had expected beneath the grime, its body so small he could have held it in one hand. The cub didn't fight, didn't bite, just let out a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a whimper as Ethan carefully extracted it from its hiding place. Logan immediately wanted to hold it, but Ethan kept the cub cradled against his chest, feeling its rapid heartbeat through his work shirt. It couldn't have weighed more than 5 pounds. A tiny bundle of fur and fear that somehow had ended up in the most unlikely place imaginable. "We need to get it some food," Logan said, already thinking ahead with the practical wisdom of children, "and water, and maybe a blanket." Ethan found himself nodding, caught up in his son's enthusiasm, forgetting for a moment that this was a wild animal, not a lost puppy. They set up a makeshift bed in a large cardboard box, lining it with shop rags that Ethan assured Logan were clean enough. The cub seemed exhausted, barely moving as they transferred it to the box, its breathing shallow but steady. "What do baby bears eat?" Logan asked, and Ethan realized he had no idea. His knowledge of bears extended to knowing you should make noise on hiking trails and never get between a mother and her cubs. Speaking of which, where was this cub's mother? The question nagged at him as Logan ran to the shop's small break room and returned with a bottle of water and half a sandwich from Ethan's lunch that he'd never gotten around to eating. "I don't think bears eat turkey sandwiches, buddy," Ethan said. But Logan was already tearing off tiny pieces of bread and placing them near the cub's mouth. To both their surprise, the cub sniffed at the bread and actually took a small piece, gumming it with teeth that hadn't fully come in yet. They sat there on the shop floor, father and son, watching this impossible little creature eat pieces of a turkey sandwich in a cardboard box. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The radio continued its quiet country music. And outside, the October wind rattled the doors. But inside their little circle, time seemed to stop. "Why do you think he was in there?" Logan asked. And Ethan had been wondering the same thing. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. The lift had been up all day with the Chevy on it. He would have heard something. And the gap where they'd found the cub, it was too small for it to have climbed in on its own, especially at its age. "I don't know, buddy," Ethan said honestly, and then added something he wouldn't have said an hour ago, "But I'm glad we found him." Logan smiled at that, the kind of pure, unguarded smile that Ethan realized he hadn't seen in months. When had his son stopped smiling like that around him? When had he become the father who was always too busy, too tired, too distracted to notice when his child needed him? The cub made a small sound, almost like a purr, and curled into a tighter ball in its box. "We should name him," Logan announced with the authority of someone who had found something, and therefore had naming rights. "We can't keep him, Logan. He belongs in the wild with other bears." But even as Ethan said it, he was looking at the cub and wondering about its chances. It was so young, clearly separated from its mother for who knows how long. Would animal control just put it down? Would they stick it in a zoo? The thought made something twist in his stomach. "Just for tonight, then," Logan bargained, already learning the art of negotiation. "We can name him just for tonight." Ethan found himself agreeing. Another surprise in an evening full of them. They went through various names, Logan suggesting everything from Fluffy to Iron Man, before settling on Rusty, because of the way the shop's overhead lights caught the reddish tones in the cub's dark fur. As they sat there, Ethan realized this was the longest conversation he'd had with Logan in weeks that wasn't about homework or chores or bedtime. The cub had somehow created a bridge between them. A shared purpose that didn't require words about feelings or explanations about why Daddy worked so much. Logan was telling Rusty about his baseball team, how he'd struck out in the last game, but Coach said that was okay because everyone strikes out sometimes, even the pros. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He should have been at that game, should have seen his son strike out and told him it was okay himself. "Daddy, look," Logan whispered, and Ethan saw that the cub had uncurled slightly, one tiny paw stretched out toward them. Logan slowly extended his finger, and the cub's paw touched it, just barely, pads soft as velvet against Logan's skin. In that moment, Ethan saw his son not as the boy who was always asking for 5 more minutes of video games or complaining about vegetables, but as a person capable of tremendous gentleness, of empathy that hadn't been hardened by the world yet. "We should probably call Mom," Ethan said, already dreading that conversation. Jessica would not be happy about this development. She barely tolerated him bringing Logan to the shop, let alone bringing home a bear cub. But Logan was already ahead of him, as children often are when it comes to managing their parents. "We could tell her together," he suggested. "And maybe, if we both explain how we found him, and how small he is, and how he has nowhere else to go." Logan trailed off, but Ethan could see the wheels turning in his son's head, already crafting the argument that would give them the best chance of keeping Rusty, at least for a little while. Ethan pulled out his phone, then hesitated. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Logan should have been in bed an hour ago, and here they were sitting on a shop floor with a bear cub in a box. This was exactly the kind of thing Jessica worried about when she said Ethan wasn't responsible enough with Logan at the shop. "Maybe we should take him home first," Ethan suggested. "Show Mom that he's not dangerous." Logan nodded enthusiastically, already standing up and looking for something to carry the box with. They fashioned a kind of carrier out of the box and some bungee cords, making sure Rusty couldn't escape but could still breathe easily. The cub seemed resigned to its fate, occasionally letting out small sounds, but mostly just watching them with those amber eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young creature. As they prepared to leave, Ethan took one last look around the shop, trying to figure out the mystery of how Rusty had gotten there in the first place. That's when he noticed something he'd missed before. Near the base of the lift, barely visible in the shadows, was a small piece of fabric caught on a bolt. He pulled it free and examined it under the light. It was dark blue, possibly from a jacket or shirt, and it was relatively fresh, not covered in the years of grime that coated everything else in that corner of the shop. Someone had been there recently, someone who might have put Rusty in that hiding spot. But why? Who would hide a bear cub in a mechanic shop? And more importantly, were they coming back for it? "Daddy, come on," Logan called from the door, already cradling the box like it contained the most precious thing in the world. Ethan pocketed the fabric and followed his son, locking the shop behind them with the strange feeling that something significant had just happened. Something that was about more than just finding a lost animal. The drive home was surreal. Logan in the back seat talking constantly to Rusty, telling him about their house, about his mom who was really nice once you got to know her, about their neighbor's cat who might not like bears but would probably come around. Ethan drove slower than usual, partly to avoid jostling the cub and partly to delay the inevitable confrontation with Jessica. They lived in a modest 2-story house in a neighborhood that had seen better days but was still respectable, the kind of place where people knew each other's names but minded their own business. As they pulled into the driveway, Ethan could see the living room lights on, Jessica's silhouette moving past the window. She was probably wondering where they were, why they were so late. Logan was already strategizing. "I'll carry Rusty, and you explain first, okay, Daddy? You're better at explaining." It was a vote of confidence Ethan didn't feel he deserved, but he nodded anyway. The moment they walked through the door, Jessica knew something was different. Maybe it was the way Logan was holding the box, or the guilty expression on Ethan's face, or just that maternal instinct that detected mischief from a mile away. "What's in the box?" she asked, her voice carrying that tone that suggested she already knew she wasn't going to like the answer. "Now, Jess, before you say anything," Ethan started, but Logan had already put the box down on the living room floor and was lifting the lid to show his mother their discovery. We found him in Daddy's shop, and he was all alone and scared, and he ate some of Daddy's sandwich, and his name is Rusty." Jessica's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if Ethan hadn't been so worried about her reaction. Surprise, disbelief, concern, and then, unexpectedly, she knelt down beside the box and really looked at the cub. Rusty chose that moment to open his eyes and look directly at her, letting out the tiniest, most pathetic sound imaginable. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered, and her hand went to her mouth. "It's so small. How is it so small?" And just like that, Ethan knew they had a chance. Jessica had always been a sucker for anything helpless. It's why she'd married him after all. She'd told him once because he'd looked so lost that first day of college when they'd met in the library. "We think he's only a few weeks old," Ethan explained, kneeling down beside his wife and son. "We found him trapped in the hydraulic lift. I have no idea how he got there, but he was terrified, Jess. We couldn't just leave him." Jessica reached out slowly, and Rusty sniffed her finger before giving it a tiny lick. She melted. Ethan could see it happen, her shoulders relaxing, the stern expression softening into something tender. "We can't keep a bear," she said, but it was weak, without conviction. "Just for tonight," Logan said, using the same argument that had worked on his father. "Tomorrow we can figure out what to do, but tonight he needs somewhere warm and safe." They set up Rusty's box in the laundry room, which was warm and quiet, and had a door they could close in case he tried to explore. Jessica found some old baby blankets from when Logan was little, stored in a box in the attic marked, "Maybe one more," in her handwriting from years ago when they'd still thought they might have another child. The blankets smelled like lavender and memories, and Rusty seemed to approve, immediately burrowing into them until only his nose was visible. Logan wanted to sleep in the laundry room with him, but that's where both parents drew the line. "He needs rest, and so do you," Jessica said, using her mom voice that brooked no argument. As they got ready for bed, the house felt different, somehow, charged with an energy it hadn't had in months. Logan was so excited he could barely brush his teeth, talking through a mouthful of toothpaste about all the things they could teach Rusty tomorrow. Jessica and Ethan found themselves standing together in the doorway of Logan's room, watching him settle into bed, something they hadn't done together in longer than either wanted to admit. "A bear cub, Ethan, really?" Jessica whispered, but she was smiling. I know, but you should have seen Logan with him. It was like, I don't know, like something clicked. We actually talked, Jess." "Really talked?" Jessica leaned against him slightly, and he put his arm around her shoulders, another thing they hadn't done in too long. "What are we going to do with it? We can't actually keep a bear." Ethan knew she was right, but something about the whole situation felt unfinished, like finding Rusty was just the beginning of something larger. "I'll call animal control in the morning, see what they recommend. Maybe there's a wildlife rehabilitation center or something." But even as he said it, he was thinking about that piece of fabric in his pocket, about the impossibility of a cub that young being in his shop by accident. They checked on Rusty one more time before bed. The cub was sleeping soundly, his tiny body rising and falling with each breath, occasionally making small sounds that might have been bear dreams. "He's kind of cute," Jessica admitted, and Ethan knew that if his tough, practical wife was saying that, they were all in trouble. They went to bed that night with a bear cub in their laundry room and more questions than answers, but also with something they hadn't had in a while, a shared experience that had nothing to do with bills or schedules, or the slow drift that had been pulling their family apart. Ethan woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't Rusty. He'd already gotten up once to check when he heard whimpering, only to find the cub had just shifted in his sleep. This was different. a soft scratching sound coming from downstairs. He grabbed the baseball bat they kept under the bed, a relic from his brief stint in minor league baseball before a shoulder injury ended that dream, and crept downstairs. The sound was coming from the laundry room, but when he carefully opened the door, Rusty was still asleep in his box. The scratching was coming from the window. There, silhouetted against the streetlight outside, was a figure. Ethan's heart raced as he realized someone was trying to open the window from the outside. He flipped on the light, raising the bat, and the figure fell backward with a yelp. When Ethan looked out the window, he saw a teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17, sprawled in Jessica's flower bed. The boy looked terrified, his eyes wide as he scrambled to his feet. "Wait!" Ethan called out, but the boy was already running, disappearing into the darkness between the houses. Ethan stood there, bat still raised, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why would someone try to break into their laundry room? Unless... He looked back at Rusty, still sleeping peacefully in his box. Someone knew the cub was here. Someone who had probably put it in the shop in the first place. But why? What was so special about this particular bear cub that someone would hide it and then try to retrieve it in the middle of the night? Ethan closed and locked the window, then dragged a chair from the kitchen and sat down in the laundry room. If someone wanted Rusty, they'd have to go through him. He sat there in the dark, listening to the cub's breathing and thinking about the strange turn his life had taken in the past few hours. When morning came, filtering gray through the window, Ethan was still in the chair, stiff and tired, but alert. Jessica found him there when she came down to start coffee, and the look on her face was a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Ethan, what are you doing?" He told her about the attempted break-in, watching her face go pale. "Someone tried to break into our house. We need to call the police." But Ethan shook his head. "I think they were after Rusty. I think someone hid him in my shop on purpose, and now they want him back." Logan appeared in the doorway, still in his dinosaur pajamas, his hair sticking up in every direction. "Is Rusty okay?" he asked, immediately going to the box to check on his new friend. The cub was awake now, making small, hungry sounds. "He needs breakfast," Logan announced, as if this was the most important thing in the world. Jessica looked between her husband and son, then at the bear cub that had somehow become the center of their universe overnight. "I'll make some calls," she said, surprising Ethan. "I have a friend from college who works with wildlife. Maybe she can tell us what we're dealing with here." While Jessica made calls and Logan fed Rusty pieces of banana that the cub seemed to enjoy, Ethan went outside to examine the flower bed where the would-be intruder had fallen. There were clear footprints in the soft soil, and something else, a wallet. The boy must have dropped it in his haste to escape. Ethan picked it up and opened it, finding a driver's license for someone named Connor Adams, age 17, with an address on the other side of town. There was also a photo, worn from handling, of Connor with what looked like his grandfather, both of them wearing matching wildlife conservation t-shirts. Ethan went back inside and showed the wallet to Jessica, who was just getting off the phone. "My friend says a cub that young shouldn't be away from its mother. Either the mother is dead or..." She paused, looking troubled. "Or someone took it." She also said something interesting. "There's been reports of bear poaching in the state forest, people taking cubs to sell on the black market. The cubs are worth a lot of money to private collectors who want exotic pets." The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made Ethan's stomach turn. Had someone stashed a stolen cub in his shop, planning to come back for it later? "We need to talk to this Connor kid," Ethan said, holding up the wallet. Jessica looked worried. "Maybe we should just call the police, let them handle it." But Logan, who had been listening while playing with Rusty, piped up. What if he was trying to save Rusty? What if he's not a bad guy? It was a possibility Ethan hadn't considered, but looking at the photo of Connor with his grandfather, both clearly involved in wildlife conservation, it didn't seem impossible. I'll go talk to him, Ethan decided. Just talk. If anything seems off, I'll call the police immediately. Jessica didn't look happy about it, but she nodded. Take your phone and be careful. Logan wanted to come too, but both parents vetoed that immediately. You stay here and take care of Rusty, Ethan told him, and Logan accepted this responsibility with the seriousness of a knight accepting a quest. The address on Connor's license led to a small apartment complex that had seen better days. Ethan climbed the stairs to Unit 3B and knocked. Not sure what he expected to find. The door opened almost immediately, and there was Connor, looking like he hadn't slept all night. I know why you're here, Connor said before Ethan could speak. And I can explain everything, but first, is the cub okay? Is he safe? There was genuine concern in the boy's voice, and Ethan found himself relaxing slightly. He's fine. My son named him Rusty. Now, you want to tell me what's going on? Connor stepped aside to let Ethan in, and the small apartment was cluttered but clean, with wildlife posters covering every wall. My grandfather used to work for the Forest Service, Connor began, gesturing to a photo on the mantel that showed the same man from the wallet picture. He passed away last month, but before he died, he told me about a group that's been poaching bear cubs from the state forest. Connor went to a desk covered in papers and pulled out a map marked with red X's. These are where cubs have gone missing over the past year. My grandfather was tracking them, trying to gather enough evidence to stop it. Last week, I was hiking in the forest, and I actually saw them. 3 men with cages. They had 2 cubs already, and they were tracking a mother with babies. I couldn't let them take another one, so I created a distraction, made noise, scared the mother away with her remaining cub. But one baby got separated in the chaos. I grabbed him before they could. And you hid him in my shop? Ethan asked, trying to follow the logic. Connor looked embarrassed. I panicked. I knew they were following me and I couldn't lead them to my apartment. Your shop was open, the lift was up, and there was that gap. I thought I could come back for him after they gave up looking, but when I went back, the shop was closed and locked. I've been watching, waiting for a chance. I'm sorry I tried to break into your house. I was desperate. I thought you might have called animal control, and if you did, the poachers have connections. They'd find out, and Rusty would end up right back where I saved him from. Ethan studied the boy's face, looking for signs of deception, but all he saw was exhaustion and genuine worry. Why didn't you go to the police? Connor laughed bitterly. With what proof? My grandfather tried that. They said without evidence of actual poaching, there was nothing they could do. And one of the poachers, I recognized him. He's someone official, someone who would know if a cub turned up at animal control. This was getting more complicated by the minute. Ethan pulled out his phone and called Jessica, putting her on speaker. I think you need to hear this, he said, and had Connor repeat his story. When he finished, Jessica was quiet for a moment. Then, bring him here. If what he's saying is true, Rusty isn't safe anywhere official. We need to figure this out together. Connor looked relieved and grateful. You believe me? My husband found a bear cub in a hydraulic lift, Jessica said dryly. At this point, I'm ready to believe anything. Just get here safely, both of you. The drive back to Ethan's house was quiet, Connor clutching a backpack that he said contained all of his grandfather's research. Ethan kept checking the mirrors, paranoid now that they might be followed. When they arrived, Logan was sitting on the living room floor with Rusty, who had graduated from the box to a large dog playpen Jessica had borrowed from a neighbor, telling them it was for a friend's puppy. The cub was more active now. Batting at a ball, Logan was rolling back and forth. "Is this him?" Logan asked when he saw Connor. "Did you save Rusty?" Connor knelt down beside the playpen, and his whole demeanor changed, became softer. "Hey there, little one. Remember me?" Rusty made a sound that might have been recognition and reached a paw through the bars toward Connor. "He remembers you," Logan said with delight. "See, Daddy, he's a good guy." They sat around the kitchen table while Connor spread out his grandfather's research. There were photos, grainy but clear enough to show men with cages, maps with patterns marked, even what looked like financial records. My grandfather figured out they were selling the cubs to private collectors overseas. There's a huge market for exotic pets, and bear cubs are especially valuable. They take them young enough that they can be domesticated, or at least that's what they tell the buyers. Jessica was studying one of the photos intently. "I know this man," she said suddenly, pointing to a figure in the background. "He works at the county administrative building. I've seen him when I've gone to pay property taxes." Connor nodded grimly. "That's one of them. Having someone on the inside means they know whenever a bear is reported found, whenever animal control gets called. They can intercept the cubs before they get to safety." It was a depressing picture they were painting, and Ethan found himself angry that this was happening in their community, that people were profiting from stealing baby animals from their mothers. "So, what do we do?" Ethan asked. "We can't keep Rusty forever, and we can't turn him over to animal control if these people have connections there." Connor pulled out another paper, this one with a phone number circled. "My grandfather had a contact at a wildlife sanctuary 2 states over. They specialize in rehabilitating orphaned cubs and releasing them back into the wild when they're old enough. They're completely independent, no government connections. If we could get Rusty there, he'd be safe." It sounded like a solution, but Ethan could see the problem immediately. That's a 12-hour drive, and if these poachers are looking for the cub, they might be watching the roads. Logan, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What if we made them think Rusty was somewhere else, like in a movie when they create a distraction?" He stumbled over the big word, but his idea was clear. Jessica smiled at her son. "A decoy? That's actually not a bad idea." They spent the next hour planning, and it felt surreal to Ethan that his family was sitting around their kitchen table, plotting to smuggle a bear cub to safety. But looking at Logan's determined face, at Jessica's protective instincts fully engaged, at Connor's desperate hope to complete his grandfather's mission, Ethan knew they were going to try. The plan was simple enough in concept. Connor would go back to the forest with a large stuffed bear they'd bought from the toy store, making sure to be seen by anyone who might be watching. He'd make it look like he was releasing a cub back into the wild. Meanwhile, Ethan would drive Rusty to the sanctuary, taking back roads and avoiding main highways. Jessica would stay home with Logan, maintaining their normal routine so no one would suspect they were involved. "It's dangerous," Jessica said, not for the first time. "These people are criminals, if they catch on." But Ethan had made up his mind. "That cub ended up in my shop for a reason. Maybe it was Connor hiding him there, but Logan found him. We found him. We can't just abandon him now." They decided to wait until the next night to put their plan into motion. In the meantime, Rusty was growing stronger, more active. Logan spent every moment he wasn't at school with the cub, and even Jessica found herself checking on him constantly, bringing him little treats, talking to him in the soft voice she used to use when Logan was a baby. Connor stayed with them, sleeping on the couch, too afraid to go back to his apartment in case the poachers were watching it. He and Logan bonded over their shared love of animals, Connor telling stories about his grandfather's work in the Forest Service, Logan sharing his encyclopedic knowledge of dinosaurs and how they were related to modern animals. That evening, as they finalized their plans, Ethan noticed something different about his family. They were working together, unified in purpose in a way they hadn't been in years. Even their dinner conversation was different, animated and engaged instead of the usual routine questions about school and work. Rusty had done this, had brought them together in the most unexpected way. "Whatever happens," Jessica said that night as they got ready for bed, "I'm glad we did this. Logan's never going to forget it." Ethan pulled her close, something he realized he hadn't done in too long. "Neither will I." The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Connor went to scout the forest roads, making sure his decoy run would be visible to anyone watching. Ethan prepared his truck for the long drive, filling it with gas, checking the tires, packing supplies. Jessica gathered everything Rusty might need for the journey. Formula they'd gotten from a veterinarian friend who asked no questions, blankets, even a small radio to provide comforting noise. Logan made a card for the sanctuary workers, carefully drawing a picture of Rusty and writing, "Please take good care of him," in his best handwriting. As evening approached, the tension in the house was palpable. Connor left first, carrying the stuffed bear in a carrier that looked remarkably like it might contain a real cub. He'd made sure to be seen at the outdoor supply store buying the carrier earlier that day, making casual conversation about releasing a rescued animal back to the wild. 20 minutes after he left, Ethan loaded Rusty into his truck. The cub seemed to sense something was happening, making small, anxious sounds. Logan insisted on saying goodbye properly, whispering something in Rusty's ear that he wouldn't tell anyone else. "Drive safe," Jessica said, kissing Ethan with an intensity that surprised them both. "Come back to us." "I will," he promised, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. The first few hours of the drive were tense. Ethan constantly checking his mirrors, taking random turns to make sure he wasn't being followed. Rusty settled down after a while, lulled by the motion of the truck. Ethan found himself talking to the cub, telling him about the sanctuary, about how he'd be with other bears, how he'd learn to be wild and free. Around midnight, Ethan's phone rang. It was Connor. "It worked," the boy said, excitement clear in his voice. "I saw them, 3 men, watching me release the decoy. They bought it completely. They even followed me for a while after I left the forest, but I lost them in town. You should be clear." Ethan felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Maybe this would actually work. He drove through the night, Rusty occasionally making small sounds from his carrier, almost like he was commenting on the journey. The roads were empty, the world sleeping while they carried out their strange mission. As dawn broke, Ethan pulled into the sanctuary. It was a beautiful place, acres of forest with proper enclosures for rehabilitation, buildings that looked well-maintained and professional. A woman named Dr. Sarah Chen met him at the entrance, Connor having called ahead to explain the situation. "You're the mechanic who found him in a lift?" she asked, and when Ethan nodded, she smiled. "That's a first for us. Let's see this little traveler." When she saw Rusty, her expression became serious and professional. "He's younger than I expected, but he looks healthy. You did good getting him here." Ethan watched as Dr. Chen examined Rusty, the cub surprisingly calm under her experienced hands. "He'll go into our nursery program first," she explained. "We have 2 other orphaned cubs about his age. They'll form a family unit, learn from each other." In about 18 months, if all goes well, they'll be released together into a protected area far from where the poaching has been happening. It was what Rusty needed, what was best for him, but Ethan found himself reluctant to leave. This small creature had changed something in his family, had brought them together in a way nothing else had. "Can we visit?" Ethan asked, thinking of Logan. How hard it would be to tell him Rusty was gone. Dr. Chen smiled kindly. "We don't usually allow it. The cubs need to stay wild, not get attached to humans, but—" She paused, studying Ethan's face. "You can receive updates, photos, progress reports, and when we release them, if you wanted to be there, from a distance, to see them go free, that could be arranged." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He said goodbye to Rusty, who was already being introduced to his new habitat, complete with climbing structures and a small pool. The cub looked back once, those amber eyes meeting Ethan's, and then he was exploring, doing what bear cubs should do. The drive home felt longer than the drive there, even though Ethan no longer had to worry about being followed. He called Jessica to let her know Rusty was safe, and he could hear Logan in the background asking a million questions. When he finally pulled into his driveway that evening, Logan was waiting on the porch, Connor beside him. Is he okay? Is he happy? Did they have other bears for him to play with? The questions tumbled out so fast Ethan could barely answer them. "He's perfect," Ethan said, scooping Logan up in a hug. "He's going to learn to be a real bear, and when he's big enough, they'll let him go free in the forest where he belongs." Logan was sad. Ethan could see it, but there was also understanding in his young face. "We saved him, didn't we, Daddy? We gave him a chance." "We did, buddy, we all did." That night, Connor told them he'd received a call from a detective who'd been friends with his grandfather. The stuffed bear decoy had led to something unexpected. The poachers, thinking their operation had been compromised, had gotten sloppy. They'd been caught trying to move their equipment out of a storage unit, and police had found evidence of their whole operation. The inside man at the county building had been arrested, too. "Your grandfather would be proud," Jessica told Connor, who looked like he might cry. "You finished what he started." They invited Connor to stay for dinner, and it turned into a celebration of sorts. Logan drew pictures of Rusty to put on the refrigerator, each one showing the cub getting bigger and stronger. Jessica made her famous lasagna, the one she usually only made for special occasions. Ethan found himself really looking at his family, seeing them clearly for the first time in months. They were good together, when they remembered to be together. After Connor left, promising to keep in touch, and Logan had finally fallen asleep after making Ethan tell the story of finding Rusty 3 times, Ethan and Jessica sat on their back porch, something they hadn't done since summer. "That was crazy," Jessica said, but she was smiling. "Completely insane. We harbored a stolen bear cub and helped smuggle it across state lines." "When you put it like that, we sound like criminals," Ethan laughed. "Worth it, though?" Jessica asked, and Ethan didn't have to think about his answer. Every second. A month later, they received their first update from the sanctuary. Rusty had doubled in size and was thriving with his new bear family. There was a photo of him play wrestling with another cub, and Logan immediately printed it out to add to his collection on the refrigerator. The shop felt different now, too. Ethan still worked late sometimes, but not as late, and when Logan came with him, they talked, really talked. About school, about friends, about dreams Logan had of being a veterinarian or maybe a forest ranger like Connor's grandfather. The hydraulic lift had been repaired, the gap where Rusty had hidden sealed up, but Ethan had kept a small reminder, a tuft of fur that had been caught on a bolt pressed between the pages of the shop's logbook. Sometimes, when he was working alone, he'd look at it and remember that night when a scared bear cub had brought his family back together. Connor became a regular visitor, joining them for Sunday dinners and helping Logan with a school project about wildlife conservation. He was applying to colleges, wanting to study environmental science, to continue his grandfather's work in a different way. 6 months passed, and another update arrived. Rusty was growing fast, learning to forage, to fish in the sanctuary's stream. He was still smaller than the other cubs his age, but what he lacked in size he made up for in determination. "Just like someone else I know," Jessica said, ruffling Logan's hair. The updates became events in their household, everyone gathering around the computer to see the latest photos and videos. They watched Rusty grow from a tiny frightened cub into a confident young bear, ready to take on the world. 2 chapters of Part 1 have been completed. The morning after Ethan returned from the sanctuary started differently than any other morning in recent memory. Logan had climbed into bed with them at dawn, something he hadn't done in over a year, clutching the stuffed bear they'd bought for Connor's decoy mission. "I dreamed about Rusty," he said softly, nestled between his parents. He was big and strong and living in the forest, but he remembered us. Jessica pulled him closer, and Ethan wrapped his arms around both of them. Their little family cocooned in the early morning quiet. It was in that moment that Ethan noticed something he'd overlooked in all the chaos, a small detail that would change everything they thought they knew about Rusty's story. Logan's stuffed bear had a tag on its ear. A realistic detail from the toy manufacturer meant to look like the tags researchers put on wild animals. But it reminded Ethan of something he'd seen but hadn't really registered when they first found Rusty. The cub had something on his ear, too, so small and covered in dirt that they'd assumed it was just matted fur or a minor injury. "Jess," Ethan said slowly, his mind racing. "Did you notice anything on Rusty's ear when we were cleaning him up?" Jessica thought for a moment, her forehead creasing in concentration. "There was something. I thought it was a tick at first, but it was under the fur. I didn't want to traumatize him more by investigating." They looked at each other over Logan's head, the same thought occurring to both of them simultaneously. Connor arrived within an hour of Ethan's call, bringing his grandfather's research materials. They spread everything out on the kitchen table again, this time looking for any mention of tagged cubs. "Here," Connor said suddenly, pointing to a notation in his grandfather's handwriting. 3 months ago, the Forest Service tagged several cubs as part of a population study. They were using new microtags, barely visible, designed to track the cubs as they grew without the bulky collars they used to use. The implications were staggering. If Rusty was one of the tagged cubs, he wasn't just any orphaned bear. He was part of an official study, which meant there would be records, data, a paper trail that the poachers might not have known about. "We need to contact Dr. Chen," Jessica said, already reaching for her phone. But Connor stopped her, his face pale. "Wait. If Rusty was tagged, and if the wrong people find out where he is now..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood. The poachers might have been arrested, but that didn't mean all their connections were gone. Someone in the system had been helping them, and there might be others. "So, what do we do?" Logan asked, his young voice cutting through the adult tension. "We can't let anything happen to Rusty." Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders again, but this time it was different. This time they knew more, understood the stakes better. Connor pulled out a laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. "My grandfather had access to the Forest Service database. They never revoked it after he retired. If I can find the tagging records..." He worked in concentrated silence while the Marshall family watched, Logan practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Got it," Connor breathed, turning the screen so they could all see. There it was, a detailed record of a male cub, approximately 4 weeks old, tagged on September 15th, tag number BC4471. The mother was identified as F226, a female who had been monitored for 3 years. The last recorded sighting was September 22nd, when the mother was observed with only 1 cub instead of the 2 she'd been seen with previously. "That's him," Connor said with certainty. "The dates match perfectly with when I saw the poachers. They must have been tracking the tagged families, knowing exactly where to find them." Jessica was reading further down the document, her expression growing more concerned. "Look at this. F226, Rusty's mother, she's special. She's part of a genetic study on bear resilience and adaptation. Her bloodline is considered crucial for maintaining genetic diversity in the regional population." This changed everything. Rusty wasn't just a rescued cub, he was scientifically important, part of the future of bears in their region. "There's more," Connor said, scrolling through related documents. "The Forest Service has been looking for BC40471 since he disappeared. There's even a reward posted for information leading to his recovery. But instead of being good news, this felt dangerous. If word got out that they'd had the cub, that they'd transported him across state lines without going through official channels, there could be legal ramifications. They'd thought they were saving him, but had they inadvertently committed a crime? "We did the right thing," Ethan said firmly, seeing the worry in Jessica's eyes. "Whatever the law says, we kept him safe when the system that was supposed to protect him had been compromised." Logan, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Can we find his mom? If she's special and important, maybe she's looking for him." It was a child's simple logic, but it sparked something in Connor's eyes. "Actually, that's not impossible. The tags have GPS capability, but they need to be within range of a receiver to transmit. If F226 is still alive, still in the area, we might be able to locate her." It seemed like a long shot, but Connor was already pulling up mapping software, overlaying it with the Forest Service tracking data. "The last reliable signal from her was here." He pointed to a section of forest about 50 miles from where Rusty had been found. If she survived whatever happened when the poachers came, she might still be in that territory. The idea that Rusty's mother might still be alive, might still be searching for her lost cub, was both heartbreaking and hopeful. But Rusty was at the sanctuary now, safe, but far from where his mother would be. "Even if we found her," Jessica said gently, "mainly for Logan's benefit, Rusty's been away too long. Bears don't usually accept cubs back after this much time has passed." But Connor was shaking his head, excited now. "That's with normal separations. But the research on F226's bloodline shows unusual behavioral patterns. Her mother, Rusty's grandmother, was documented accepting an orphaned cub into her family group. Totally unprecedented behavior. There might be a chance." They spent the rest of the morning debating what to do. The safe thing would be to leave everything as it was, let Rusty grow up at the sanctuary, let the authorities sort out the tagged cub situation if it ever came to light. But looking at Logan's hopeful face, at the possibility of reuniting a mother and cub, even Ethan's practical nature was wavering. "We need more information," he finally said. "Connor, can you use your grandfather's credentials to check if F226 has been spotted recently without alerting anyone?" While Connor worked on that, Jessica made lunch, trying to maintain some normalcy in their increasingly abnormal situation. That afternoon, Connor found what they were looking for. 3 days ago, a ranger had logged a sighting of F226, noting that she appeared to be searching behavior, returning repeatedly to the same areas, calling out more frequently than normal. "She's looking for him," Logan said with absolute certainty. "She hasn't given up." The emotion in the room was palpable. Every parent could understand that desperate searching, that refusal to give up hope. Jessica had tears in her eyes, and Ethan found himself thinking about all the times Logan had been out of his sight for even a moment, and the panic that had ensued. "Dr. Chen," Ethan said suddenly. "She would know what to do. She's devoted her life to these animals. She'd want what's best for Rusty." They called the sanctuary, and when Dr. Chen heard about the tag, about F226, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "This changes things," she finally said. "If there's even a chance of successful reunification, we have to consider it. But it would have to be done very carefully, very scientifically, and officially, I can't sanction anything that might put the cub at risk." But then her tone changed, became less formal. "However, if someone were to bring me more data on F226's current behavior, if we could document that she's actively searching, showing signs of acceptance rather than aggression, then perhaps we could propose a formal reunification attempt to the Forest Service." It was as close to permission as they were going to get. Connor immediately volunteered to go into the forest to track F226, to document her behavior. "I know those woods. My grandfather taught me how to track, how to observe without disturbing. I can do this." But Ethan wasn't letting the teenager go alone, not after everything that had happened. "I'm coming with you," he said, and when Jessica started to protest, he added, "We started this together. We should see it through together." They planned to go the next morning, early enough to avoid other hikers, but late enough that the bears would be active. That evening, as they prepared equipment, borrowing a trail camera from Connor's grandfather's collection, Jessica pulled Ethan aside. "This is dangerous, you know that, right? Not just physically, but legally. If anyone finds out what we're doing—" "I know," Ethan said, pulling her close. "But look at him." He gestured to where Logan and Connor were carefully packing supplies, Logan insisting on including a picture of Rusty in case they needed to show his mom. "When did we stop taking risks for things that matter? When did we become so careful that we forgot how to be brave?" Jessica kissed him then, really kissed him, like she had when they were young, and believed they could change the world. The next morning came crisp and clear, one of those perfect autumn days that made the forest look like a painting. Connor and Ethan set out before dawn, while Jessica and Logan stayed home to maintain the pretense of normalcy. Logan had wanted desperately to come, but even he understood that tracking a wild bear was not something a 7-year-old should do. "Find her," he whispered to his father. "Tell her Rusty's okay." The forest was different in the early morning, alive with sounds and movements that the casual hiker never experienced. Connor moved with surprising stealth for a teenager, clearly well taught by his grandfather. They found the first signs of F226 after 2 hours of hiking, claw marks on a tree that were fresh, maybe a day old. Connor set up the trail camera nearby, explaining that bears often return to the same marking spots. They moved deeper into the forest, following game trails and creek beds, looking for more signs. It was Ethan who heard it first, a sound that made the hair on his arm stand up. It was a call, low and mournful, unlike anything he'd ever heard. Connor grabbed his arm, eyes wide. "That's her. That's a mother calling for a cub." They moved toward the sound as quietly as possible, using binoculars to scan ahead, and then they saw her. F226 was magnificent, even from a distance. She was larger than Ethan had expected, her coat thick and glossy despite the stress she must have been under. She was standing on her hind legs, nose in the air, testing the wind. Then she called again, that same mournful sound, and Ethan's heart broke a little. She dropped back to all fours and began moving through the underbrush, clearly following a pattern, a search grid she'd probably repeated dozens of times. Connor was documenting everything with a video camera, whispering notes about her behavior, her apparent health, her search pattern. They followed her for 3 hours, maintaining a safe distance, watching as she checked every hollow log, every cave, every place a small cub might hide. At one point, she stopped at a clearing and sat down, just sat there in the middle of the forest, and made a different sound, softer, almost like she was singing. "She's grieving," Connor whispered, and Ethan had to look away, the emotion too raw. They set up 3 more trail cameras in her territory, places she seemed to return to regularly. As they were preparing to leave, F226 did something extraordinary. She approached a fallen tree where another bear had left scent markings, sniffed it carefully, and then, instead of adding her own mark or moving on, she made that calling sound again. "She's asking," Connor breathed. "She's asking other bears if they've seen her cub. I've never seen anything like this." They had what they needed, documented proof that F226 was actively searching, showing signs of sustained maternal behavior well past the normal separation period. The hike back was quiet, both of them processing what they'd witnessed. As they reached the trailhead where they'd parked, Ethan's phone buzzed with messages from Jessica. Dr. Chen had called. She'd been doing research of her own and had discovered something important about the microtags. They had a feature that nobody had been using, a low-frequency signal that could be detected by the mother bears, designed to help them locate cubs in dense underbrush. If they could get Rusty close enough to his mother, she would know it was him, not just any cub. They drove home with a new sense of urgency. This wasn't just about reuniting a mother and cub anymore. It was about using science and compassion together to heal something that had been broken by greed. When they got home, Logan was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. "Did you find her? Did you see her? What did she look like?" They showed him the video, and even on the small camera screen, F226's presence was powerful. "She's beautiful," Logan said softly, "and sad. We have to help her." Dr. Chen called that evening with a proposal. She'd contacted a colleague at the Forest Service, someone she trusted absolutely, and explained the situation. There was going to be an official attempt at reunification, but it had to be done secretly to avoid media attention and potential interference from any remaining poaching connections. "We'll bring Rusty back in stages," she explained. "First to a rehabilitation facility closer to his original territory, then gradually into areas where F226 has been spotted. We'll monitor both of them constantly. If there's any sign of rejection or aggression, we abort immediately." The plan would take 2 weeks to implement. 2 weeks of careful preparation, of moving Rusty without attracting attention, of monitoring F226 to ensure she remained in the area. Connor would be part of the official team, his documentation of F226's behavior having impressed the Forest Service enough to overlook his unofficial methods. The Marshall family wouldn't be able to be directly involved in the reunification. It would be too dangerous and potentially legally problematic. But Dr. Chen promised to keep them updated every step of the way. Those 2 weeks were the longest of Logan's young life. He marked off each day on the calendar, drew pictures of Rusty and F226 together, and asked constant questions about what was happening. Jessica threw herself into research, learning everything she could about bear behavior and reunification attempts. Ethan found himself distracted at work, his mind constantly wandering to a small cub and his grieving mother somewhere in the forest. The shop felt different now, charged with the memory of that night when everything had changed. Finally, the day came. Dr. Chen called early in the morning to say that Rusty had been successfully transferred to the temporary facility. He was healthy, strong, and showing all the right behaviors for a potential release. F-226 had been located and was being monitored. The reunification attempt would happen that afternoon. "I know you can't be there," Dr. Chen said, "but Connor will be documenting everything. You'll be able to see it all later." The waiting was agony. Logan stayed home from school, too anxious to concentrate. Jessica baked 3 different kinds of cookies, nervous energy needing an outlet. Ethan paced, unable to settle to anything. At 4:17 p.m., Connor called. His voice was shaking with emotion. "It worked," he said, and then he was crying too hard to continue. Dr. Chen took the phone. "It was extraordinary," she said, her professional composure clearly strained. "We released Rusty in a clearing where F-226 had been seen that morning. He was vocalizing, making the calls cubs make for their mothers. F-226 appeared within minutes. She must have been close. She approached slowly, cautiously. Rusty seemed to recognize her immediately, ran right to her. She sniffed him all over, and then she laid down and let him nurse. After all this time, she accepted him back immediately." Logan was jumping up and down, tears streaming down his face. Jessica was crying too, and Ethan felt his own eyes burning. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd brought a family back together. Connor arrived at their house an hour later with the video footage. They watched in awe as F-226 and Rusty reunited, the mother bear's body language changing from grief to joy in a matter of moments. The way Rusty had curled into her, safe and home at last, was something none of them would ever forget. "Your grandfather would be so proud," Jessica told Connor, who nodded, unable to speak. They ordered pizza and celebrated quietly, a strange family brought together by an even stranger circumstance. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led them here. If Connor hadn't hidden Rusty in the shop, if Logan hadn't heard him crying, if they hadn't been brave enough to get involved, none of this would have happened. Sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as inconveniences, as problems to be solved. A month later, they received one final update. F-226 and Rusty had been spotted together multiple times, both healthy and thriving. The micro-tag data showed they were staying close together, normal behavior for a mother and cub. The Forest Service had used the successful reunification as a catalyst for increasing surveillance and protection of the bear population. 3 more poaching rings had been discovered and shut down. Connor had been offered an internship with the Forest Service, his actions having caught the attention of people who mattered. The Marshall family had returned to their normal routine, but normal felt different now. Ethan still worked at the shop, but he made sure to be home for dinner most nights. Logan had become the class expert on bears, giving a presentation that had his teacher in tears. Jessica had started volunteering with a local wildlife organization, her organizational skills proving invaluable. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, they would sit together and look at the pictures of Rusty, remembering the brief time when a bear cub had lived in their laundry room and changed their lives forever. The shop's hydraulic lift still worked perfectly, that gap long since sealed. But Ethan had installed a small plaque that only he and Logan knew about, hidden where customers wouldn't see it. It simply said Rusty's Place, with the date they'd found him. Logan liked to touch it for luck whenever he visited the shop, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things happened in the most ordinary places. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got to be part of something larger than yourself, something that mattered. One evening, 6 months after the reunification, Connor stopped by with news. He'd been tracking F-226 and Rusty as part of his internship, and he had something to show them. On his laptop was recent footage from a trail camera. F-226 was there, healthy and strong, and beside her were 2 cubs. One was Rusty, now much larger but still recognizable by a small mark on his ear where the tag had been. The other was a new cub, smaller, probably born that spring. She had another baby, Logan said wonderingly. Rusty has a brother or sister. It was the perfect ending to their story, life continuing, families growing. The forest healing itself with a little help from some unlikely heroes. As Connor left that night, he paused at the door. You know, my grandfather always said that conservation wasn't just about saving animals. It was about saving the part of ourselves that cares, that connects us to something wild and free. You guys, you saved that too, for me, for Logan, maybe for a lot of people who will hear this story someday. After he left, the Marshall family sat together in their living room, Logan wedged between his parents on the couch. Do you think Rusty remembers us? Logan asked sleepily. I think he remembers being safe, Ethan said, kissing the top of his son's head. And loved, that's what matters. Jessica leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around both of them. Outside, the world continued its spinning, full of problems and challenges and reasons to be afraid. But inside their small house, in their small town, a family that had found its way back to each other sat together, united by the memory of a small bear cub who had needed them as much as they had needed him. And somewhere in the forest, under the same stars, a mother bear curled around her cubs, her family complete once more. The story of Rusty became something of a legend in their town, told and retold with various embellishments. But for the Marshall family, it remained personal, precious, a reminder of what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, action over indifference. Logan grew up to become a wildlife biologist, inspired by those few days when he was 7 and helped save a bear. He would often tell his own children about Rusty, about their grandfather who could fix anything, even broken families, both human and bear. And sometimes, when he was out in the field, he would see a bear in the distance and wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was descended from a small cub who had once lived in a laundry room and changed everything.